I never trust stairs. I always think they're up to something. Right, this video, the final one of our case study. This video is going to focus on the responses in both Haiti and New Zealand. The second bullet point, immediate and long-term responses to a tectonic hazard. Yes, they will be covered in this video as well. There is also a more general video that covers prediction, planning, protection, and monitoring. This one's going to be case study focused, though. So in terms of responses, responses can be divided in several ways, but we'll just focus on the short-term, long-term one that the exam board wants for the time being. So our short-term response is defined there. A response in the days and weeks immediately after a disaster. Essentially, it's what people do directly after, in this case, an earthquake event. They generally involve trying to keep people alive. You're not really too worried about the economy at this point, the impact on trade and money. You're interested in simply keeping people alive. It's the immediate response. It's almost the natural response of human beings. Self-preservation, keep yourself alive, and then try to keep other people alive. So that's your short-term or immediate response. The long-term response, this is weeks, months, years after the disaster. This is when you start considering more than simply keeping people alive. You start to think about people's quality of life, their standard of living, and you also, as you see there, you start thinking about the local and national economy as well. Rebuilding is an important part there. A long-term response is rebuilding destroyed homes. You don't do that immediately after an earthquake. You don't turn up and go, right, let's put some bricks down, boys. That isn't what you do. You try and keep people alive. Long-term, after you've kept people alive, you then start trying to rebuild the area you're in. Crucially, the second bit of long-term there says, and trying to put in protections for the next earthquake. So you try to learn the lessons of this earthquake. What went well? Let's try and do that again. What didn't go well? Let's try and fix that next time. So a previous exam question just popped up there in the yellow box. Which is the most important, short-term or long-term? Now, immediately, you'll get drawn towards short-term being the most important because you keep people alive. And if you can keep people alive, then those people can keep other people alive. But the reality is, I'd probably advise you, I should say there's no right answer or wrong answer with this. You could argue either. I think it's probably easier to argue the long-term being more important. And the reason for it is that sentence there in bold at the end, which I've just badly highlighted. With a long-term response, you can put in protections next time, which means that there's less injury, less building collapse, and less death. So we'll look at that through our New Zealand example in a minute. But the overall concept is, if you have good long-term planning, it actually makes the short-term effects less serious, and therefore it makes the short-term responses less serious. I'll do this again on the final slide of this PowerPoint to try and show you with an applied example how this works. But if I were to get that previous exam question, I would always say that the long term is actually more important than the short term. Hopefully, as we go through this video, you can see the reason why. Right then, Haiti, your LIC case study. What did people do immediately after the earthquake? Well, you've got your residents of the capital city, Port-au-Prince. They dig with their bare hands. Why do they dig with their bare hands? Well, because they didn't have any equipment at hand to do so. In the New Zealand earthquake, had more buildings had fallen down, probably people would have actually done this as well. However, the difference being in Haiti, that this was pretty much it. There was nothing else coming to assist the people, to dig people out. It was simply using their hands. One of the other things they would have done is they would have tried to keep the noise down to a minimum and place their ear down to the ground to try and hear people trapped under those 300,000 buildings that had collapsed. We had a digger. One digger was sent across the border from Dominican Republic. You can see the map there at the bottom right. The Dominican Republic takes up the east side of the island and Haiti takes up the west side. The Dominican Republic had one digger and they sent to Haiti one digger. It took about a week to reach the capital city, and the reason for that was the roads were blocked, and you needed a digger to clear the road, so the digger had to almost clear the way on the way there as well. So one digger, picture that, one digger for 300,000 buildings collapsed. What else happened? We had bottled water and purification tablets were provided. Mainly that was provided by foreign countries and not Haiti itself, because Haiti simply didn't have the money to actually, or certainly didn't have the plan or the stockpile of water to hand that out. So countries were donating money. You can see there at the bottom, if I jump to the bottom one, the UK donated £20 million almost immediately after the event. It was within a week, £20 million was given to Haiti to try to help their recovery. And the idea is the Haiti government would then buy resources it needed from the global market to then provide to its population. Another immediate response, you got there, 250,000 people moved away from Port-au-Prince. So the buildings in Port-au-Prince that stayed up were still very damaged and at risk of collapse. So the government essentially pushed those people out of the city to try and keep them safe and move them to places that were safer. You've got less damaged cities there, but also into tent cities, something that will come up a little bit later in this video. So the trouble with the immediate responses in Haiti is that as an LIC, there wasn't an established plan in place, that they didn't have the money to invest in a plan, and therefore the responses that Haiti, the country itself, did were actually quite limited. Most of the immediate responses in Haiti were provided from countries provided internationally, for example, Dominican Republic, but mainly the HICs like the UK and the USA. So our evaluation is a very, very slow response. It took the country by surprise, and a lack of stockpiling, which is when you get resources ready for this event, meant that you had a lot of looting taking place as people were left with nothing and had no food, no water, and as a result broke into supermarkets and shops to get food to feed their families. That didn't happen in New Zealand, as you'll see in a moment. Not enough bottled water being provided led to a cholera outbreak. That's when people are drinking dirty water. That causes even more problems, because then you have more people turning up in hospital needing treatment, and it means that the level of treatment for people in the earthquake is far worse than it would have been. We've got there a lack of plan meant the death toll was higher. There wasn't a system in place for emergency services or for the army to be called on, or a trained team ready to step in and take action. And as a result, simply more people died because people weren't found quickly under the rubble. And actually in the aftermath, they simply didn't hand out food and water in an organised fashion. So the immediate response is very, very poor in Haiti. Very poor. Let's compare that to New Zealand. In New Zealand, there was a plan in place. The HIC government of New Zealand has the tax money or the tax income to be able to actually put this into a plan to keep people safe in these instances. So let's have a little look. What have we got here? New Zealand, they had the stop, drop and hold drill. People were taught this in school and taught this in workplaces. And when the earthquake happened, people on the ground, the average person, knew what to do. It kept them safer on the ground, that because they were holding on to something, they weren't falling over, and they're less likely that something's going to fall on them if they are pinned to an object themselves. Residents evacuated to Central Park, as they'd been told to do. They were told if there was an earthquake, get out into an open space. The New Zealand government, or Christchurch government, had planned to have open space in their cities for this to happen. If there was an earthquake, run to that area because buildings can't fall on you. It was part of the long-term plan to have these open spaces, and the long-term plan to tell people to do that. But in the short term, people did it. And as a result, less people were injured from falling glass or falling material from a building. In the immediate aftermath, we've got the ENSA team. They coordinated the search and rescue. They had high-tech equipment such as thermal cameras. You'll see the sniffer dog there to the right-hand side, where this team had been provided by the government. The high tax income that the government has means they can invest in the NZERT team, the New Zealand Emergency Response Team, and as a result, they could find people, they could distribute food very quickly, distribute water. They had people on the ground who were trained paramedics, who helicopter pilots, who search and rescue experts, and it meant that they could find people very, very quickly. As a result, less people are trapped for as long, less people suffocate, less people die. Going back one, the NZERT team or the NZERT team zoned off areas to avoid unsafe buildings. So the cathedral in Christchurch was damaged, and as a result, within a day, they had a fence put up around the area and warnings put up to people to not go near that building. Parts of the roof actually collapsed a couple of days later because the building was damaged, but it wasn't damaged enough to fall down. A small aftershock then led the part of the roof to collapse, but because the area was cordoned off, gated off, if you like, fenced off, it meant that people weren't injured by that. Australia, very local to New Zealand, 300 police officers were flown in to assist, and the assistance they gave was handing out water and food and to manage traffic and things like that, just so the emergency response team could get on with their job. And bottled water was sent from other New Zealand cities. Remember, this is a HIC, it's a high-income country, so other cities in the islands of New Zealand could essentially donate water to Christchurch and sent them there on helicopters, planes, by road, etc. And it meant that you didn't get a cholera outbreak here because there was plenty of water to go around. So the evaluation, really low death toll here. Only 185 people died in the New Zealand earthquake. There's no cholera outbreak. It's this idea that pre-planning and education save lives. So if I just highlight that a second, this is that bit that I spoke about earlier. What's more important then? Is it the long term or is it the short term? Yes, the short term was very effective in New Zealand, but the reason it was so effective is because there's this long term response. This long term plan has been put in place by the New Zealand government. The reason the New Zealand government can put this plan in place is because they have a high tax income and they can spend on planning for tectonic hazards, something that the Haiti government simply couldn't do. What about long-term responses in Haiti then? Because LIC income's there less than $1,000 per year, Haiti is dependent on overseas aid. They simply didn't have the money in the government to go and plough into long-term responses to try and get the economy started, or to build new houses or whatever it might be. So new homes were built to a higher standard. The US government went in to help, but the response was very, very, very slow. A year later, over 1 million people were still living in temporary shelters. There's an image of that I'm highlighting in the bottom right-hand corner. 1 million people a year later are still in those tent cities, which was an immediate response to try and stop people being exposed to harsh weather conditions and whatever else that they might be exposed to out on the street. But a year later, 1 million people still in these shelters. The port rebuild was also very, very slow. That's Port-au-Prince, remember, the capital city. It was very slow because it cost a lot of money to do that, and the Haiti government simply didn't have that money. So the long-term responses in Haiti are really very similar to the short-term responses, that they haven't been very effective. So the evaluation, people in HICs immediately after the event donated money. You had that figure previously. The UK government donated £20 million. And there was the shelter box appeal that you'll cover in class as well. But essentially, it kind of just disappeared after that. People lost interest in HICs. It wasn't reported on the news as much. And as a result, that money dried up quite quickly. 98% of the rubble was not cleared up after 6 months, shows how poor the long-term response was. Roads were still blocked over 2 to 3 years later. Haiti has not recovered developmentally from this earthquake. If you got there, the earthquake shrank Haiti's gross national income by 5%. Quite simply, the responses in this earthquake have not been effective in getting Haiti even back to the position it was in. And probably most worryingly for this country is that there's a lack of ability to put plans in place for the next earthquake. The buildings that have been rebuilt by the Haitians are not built to a higher standard. They're almost exactly what they were before. and as a result, the next earthquake is likely to have the exact same effects. So it's a really, really tough one. It's not a good review of Haiti's responses. The short-term responses were very poor. The long-term responses were equally poor. And unfortunately, when the next earthquake rolls around, and there will be another earthquake in Haiti, the effects are likely to be as severe as the most recent one. New Zealand's long-term responses. The first one looks a bit strange. 10,000 homes demolished after the event. That is when the New Zealand government sent building surveyors out into Christchurch to check the buildings, and if the buildings weren't safe, the New Zealand government simply knocked them down because they said it's simply not worth the risk to keep these buildings up. Compare that to Haiti, that just simply didn't happen. Okay, in Haiti, if a building was damaged but it stayed up, that was considered fine, and people were told, well, that's great, go and live in that house. It's a disastrous policy when the next earthquake occurs. In New Zealand, those homes are demolished to make sure people can't be affected by it. Temporary housing was provided for residents whose houses had collapsed or was demolished after the event. So the New Zealand government literally provided a house, not a tent, for those people after the event to try and keep their quality of life as high as you possibly could. And temporary housing was rent-free as well. We've got retrofitting there. Retro means old, so old fitting of older damaged buildings. What that meant is any buildings that were built before 1980, the New Zealand Christchurch government went back to and have then added more defences to them. Any buildings that were damaged but could be repaired, they've added defences to them as well. The idea behind that, obviously, is the buildings are less likely to fall down or be damaged next time, therefore saving more money and saving lives. All water, gas, and electricity was restored within a month. That just shows you how fast these responses were, and people's life pretty much went back to normal after about a month of this earthquake. A long-term response that was very unpopular in Christchurch at the time was that the Rugby World Cup games were moved. New Zealand was hosting this tournament. Christchurch was due to host games. However, because of the damage to the roads and to the stadium itself, those games were moved, and that counts as a response as well as an effect, actually, to keep people safe. Evaluation: yes, there was stress and trauma, but the city and actually the country as a whole rebounded very quickly. The economic impact of the Rugby World Cup games being cancelled it was short term, but it is a serious effect. We are talking tens of millions of New Zealand dollars there would be lost from that event. However, they rebounded so quickly that the New Zealand rugby team were playing games in Christchurch again within a year. So it's a short-term economic response. And in addition, probably most importantly, is the Christchurch government, the New Zealand government, has learnt from things that went wrong in this earthquake. And you can see in the bottom right-hand corner there, your man is fitting plastic water pipes there to try and reduce even further the amount of damage that has happened here, where old pipes are now being replaced to try and stop anything like this happening again, and the same can be said for gas pipes. So the long-term responses, the long-term plan will improve off of this event to actually reduce the number of impacts in the future. So finally, summary on the responses. New Zealand short-term, long-term responses were very successful. Only 185 deaths, only that one 3-story building collapsing, but it wasn't perfect. You still had deaths, you still had buildings collapsing. Haiti, the opposite, it was incredibly unsuccessful. Both of them have been, both short-term and long-term, I should say, have been both very, very poorly coordinated, and mainly that's because simply that they just lack the money to do any better, really. So overall responses, I remember that exam question I mentioned previously. The New Zealand example is such a great example to show how long-term responses and long-term planning means that the short-term responses become less important because there's fewer effects. Look at Haiti, the lack of a long-term plan and a long-term response means that the short-term effects are much more serious and the short-term responses become more serious. And when they don't work, you've got massive problems, 316,000 deaths as an example. Hopefully that all makes sense. Any questions, come and see us in H7, I think my room is now. and obviously email us as well.